Princess Zarathel stood at the massive window of her palace chamber, watching 3 suns set over the crystal spires of her home world. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow she would marry a human. The idea still felt strange to her. Humans were such odd creatures. They lived barely 100 years, had no natural psychic abilities, and could not even breathe the air of most worlds without special equipment. Yet here she was, about to bind her life to one of them because the Galactic Council had decided it would help keep peace between their species. Her father, King Morveth, had explained it carefully. The humans were new to space travel, only leaving their home planet called Earth about 50 years ago. They were eager to make friends and prove they could be trusted. A marriage between royal families would show the galaxy that different species could work together. Zarathel had seen pictures of her future husband, Marcus Chen. He looked pleasant enough with kind brown eyes and short dark hair. He was tall for a human but still shorter than most males of her species. In the diplomatic meetings he had spoken softly and asked thoughtful questions about her culture. He seemed genuinely interested in learning about her people, the Celestial Dominion. What surprised her most was how different he was from the other aliens who had wanted to marry her. Those suitors had boasted about their wealth, their psychic powers, or their military victories. Marcus had simply asked about her favorite books and whether she enjoyed stargazing. When she mentioned her love for ancient poetry, he had quoted something from Earth literature that made her laugh. The wedding ceremony took place in the Grand Hall of Stars, a room so large it could hold 10,000 guests. Representatives from dozens of alien species attended, their various forms creating a colorful crowd. Some breathed methane and wore special suits. Others floated in gravity fields or perched on crystal platforms. Marcus arrived wearing traditional human formal clothes called a tuxedo, but he had added elements from her culture as a sign of respect. Around his neck he wore a crystal pendant that glowed with soft blue light, showing he accepted his place in her family. When he saw her walking down the long aisle, his face lit up with a genuine smile that made her feel warm inside. The ceremony itself was beautiful, but felt strange. They exchanged vows in both their languages, promising to care for each other and work for peace between their peoples. When Marcus spoke her language, his accent was careful but correct. He had clearly spent months learning to pronounce the words properly. The most touching moment came when they performed the traditional joining of hands. In her culture, this was when couples shared their life energy, creating a bond that would last forever. Most aliens could feel this connection immediately, but humans had no psychic abilities, so Marcus could not sense what was happening. He simply trusted her and held her hands while she reached out with her mind to touch his. What she found shocked her. Instead of the simple, quiet thoughts she expected from a human, she encountered something vast and deep. For just a moment, she felt like she was touching the edge of an ocean that stretched beyond the horizon. Then Marcus gently squeezed her hands and the feeling disappeared. After the ceremony, they attended a grand feast with hundreds of guests. Marcus sat beside her at the high table, eating carefully and asking quiet questions about the various dishes. He was polite to everyone who approached them, but Zarathel noticed something odd. The older, more powerful aliens seemed unusually respectful to him. They would start conversations with their usual arrogance, then gradually become more humble as they spoke. Lord Kethan, a being from a warrior species known for their pride, actually apologized to Marcus for interrupting him during dinner. This was the same Lord Kethan who had once made an ambassador wait for 3 days because the ambassador had used the wrong title when addressing him. When Zarathel mentioned this to Marcus later, he just smiled and said that respect was something humans valued greatly. He suggested that maybe the other aliens could sense his sincere wish to understand them. Their first weeks of marriage were surprisingly pleasant. Marcus proved to be thoughtful and kind. He brought her small gifts from Earth, including books of poetry that had been translated into her language. He listened carefully when she taught him about her people's history and customs. In return, he shared stories about his home world, describing blue oceans and green forests that sounded impossibly beautiful. Marcus had his own quarters in the palace, but he spent most evenings in her library, reading or working on diplomatic documents. Sometimes she would find him standing on her balcony, looking up at the stars with an expression she could not read. When she asked what he was thinking about, he would always smile and say he was remembering home. The other palace residents seemed to like Marcus well enough, though they clearly thought the princess had made a poor match. Her cousin Nethys once asked why she had not insisted on marrying someone from a more advanced species. After all, humans could not even live as long as most pets owned by the royal family. But Zarathel found Marcus refreshing. He never tried to impress her with displays of power or wealth. He was content to listen to her thoughts and share quiet moments together. When she had nightmares about her responsibilities as future ruler, he would sit beside her and tell calm stories about Earth until she fell asleep again. There were small things that puzzled her, though. Sometimes when they walked through the palace together, the ancient security systems would behave strangely. Doors that should have remained locked would open for Marcus, even though he wore none of the special devices that were supposed to control them. The palace's quantum computer, which normally only responded to members of the royal family, had somehow added Marcus to its approved user list without anyone programming it to do so. Marcus also had an odd relationship with the palace's collection of historical artifacts. These items were thousands of years old and protected by energy fields that prevented most people from getting too close. But whenever Marcus passed by, the artifacts would shift slightly, as if turning to watch him. The ancient crystal formations that decorated the main halls would glow a little brighter when he was near. When Zarathel asked the palace's head curator about this, the old alien looked confused and worried. He said the artifacts had never behaved that way before, but all the sensors showed they were perfectly stable. He suggested that perhaps human biorhythms created some kind of harmonic resonance with the crystal matrix. It sounded scientific enough that Zarathel accepted the explanation. The strangest incident happened during their second month of marriage. They were attending a cultural event in the city when a group of terrorists attacked the building. The aliens responsible used advanced weapons to seal all the exits and trap everyone inside. Palace security estimated it would take hours to break through the energy barriers. But somehow, Marcus had guided groups of civilians to safety through routes that later proved to be impossible. The security recordings showed empty hallways and sealed passages where hundreds of people claimed they had walked with Marcus leading them. When questioned about it, Marcus said he had simply found some service tunnels that were not marked on the official building plans. The incident report was filed away as a lucky coincidence, but Zarathel began to suspect that her quiet, gentle husband might be hiding more than just homesickness for Earth. 6 months into their marriage, Zarathel began to notice that strange things happened around Marcus more often than could be explained by coincidence. It started small. The palace's environmental systems seemed to adjust themselves whenever Marcus entered a room. The temperature would become perfect, the lighting would soften to exactly the right level, and even the air circulation would change to create a gentle breeze. When she asked the maintenance staff about it, they looked puzzled and said all the controls were set to automatic. But the same systems never made such precise adjustments for anyone else. During diplomatic meetings, something even more unusual occurred. The palace hosted visitors from many different species, each with their own customs about respect and protocol. Some aliens expected to be greeted with complex ceremonies. Others preferred direct conversation. A few communicated through sense or color changes that most people could not detect. Marcus somehow always knew exactly how to approach each visitor. He would bow at precisely the right angle for warrior species, speak in the formal tones that pleased ancient races, and even respond to chemical signals that should have been impossible for humans to sense. When Zarathel asked how he knew so much about alien customs, Marcus said he had studied extensively before coming to their world, but she had access to the same diplomatic databases that Marcus claimed to use, and they contained nothing about half the species-specific behaviors he demonstrated. The most troubling incidents involved the palace's security systems. The royal residence contained technology so advanced that even other members of the Galactic Council did not fully understand how it worked. Ancient quantum locks protected the most valuable artifacts and state secrets. These locks required genetic verification, psychic authentication, and mathematical keys that changed every few seconds. Yet doors throughout the palace had begun opening for Marcus without any apparent authorization. At first, the security chief assumed someone had programmed Marcus into the system during the wedding preparations. But when they checked the access logs, they found no record of any changes. The quantum lock simply recognized Marcus as someone who belonged there. The security chief, a methodical alien named Vorak, conducted a thorough investigation. He discovered that Marcus had somehow gained access to areas of the palace that were restricted even to most members of the royal family. The archives that contained thousand-year-old state secrets, the weapon vaults where planet-destroying technology was stored, the communication centers that connected to intelligence networks across the galaxy. When Vorak confronted Marcus about these security breaches, the human looked genuinely surprised. He said he had simply been exploring the palace and assumed that any door that opened for him was somewhere he was allowed to go. He apologized for any confusion and promised to ask permission before entering new areas. Vorak reported this conversation to King Morveth, but the king was more puzzled than angry. The security systems had been designed by a species known for their obsessive attention to detail. They did not make mistakes or allow unauthorized access. If the systems accepted Marcus, there had to be a reason. Around the same time, the palace's collection of ancient artifacts began behaving even more strangely. The museum contained relics from the earliest days of galactic civilization. Some items were so old that their original purpose had been forgotten. Others were known to possess almost magical properties that modern science could not explain. These artifacts had always been carefully contained behind energy fields and protective barriers. They were studied by scholars but never handled directly, since many of them were believed to be dangerous. Some could influence minds. Others could manipulate matter at the atomic level. A few were thought to contain trapped energy powerful enough to destroy entire star systems. But when Marcus visited the museum, the artifacts would strain against their containment fields as if trying to reach him. Ancient crystal formations would pulse with light. Metal objects would vibrate gently. Even items that had been completely inactive for centuries would show signs of power fluctuation. The museum's head curator, Dr. Yelthis, was both fascinated and terrified by these phenomena. She had spent her entire career studying these artifacts, and nothing like this had ever happened before. She began following Marcus during his visits, taking careful measurements and observations. Dr. Yelthis discovered that the artifacts were not just reacting to Marcus's presence. They were trying to communicate with him. The energy patterns they produced matched ancient languages that predated most known civilizations. When she played recordings of these patterns for linguistic experts, they identified fragments that translated to words like inheritor, guardian, and return. She shared these findings with Zarathel, who became even more confused about her husband's true nature. When she asked Marcus about the artifact's behavior, he said he found it interesting but claimed to have no idea why it was happening. He suggested that maybe humans had some unknown compatibility with ancient technology. The princess began watching Marcus more carefully during their daily life together. She noticed that he had habits that seemed odd for someone who was supposedly new to galactic civilization. He would sometimes pause in the middle of conversations, tilting his head as if listening to something she could not hear. When she asked what he was doing, he would always say he was just thinking. Marcus also displayed knowledge that went far beyond what any human diplomat should possess. During a state dinner with representatives from the Andromedan Collective, Marcus casually mentioned details about their homeworld's geology that were not included in any public databases. When questioned about this, he said he had read about it in an old Earth science journal, but Zarathel later checked with the human embassy, and they confirmed that Earth scientists had never conducted geological surveys of Andromedan worlds. Another incident occurred during a meeting with trade negotiators from the Tau Ceti Alliance. The discussion had reached a deadlock over mineral rights in a disputed system. Marcus suggested a compromise that involved mining operations in asteroid fields that were not mentioned in any of the official star charts. When the Tau Ceti representatives checked their private navigation records, they found that the asteroid fields Marcus described did exist and would indeed solve their resource problems. How had Marcus known about asteroid fields that were secret military information? The most unsettling moment came during a formal reception for elderly diplomats from across the galaxy. These were beings who had lived for thousands of years and had seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations. They were respected for their wisdom and treated with great ceremony by everyone. But when Marcus entered the room, several of these ancient beings immediately stood up, as if they recognized him. One elderly crystalline, whose species was known for their perfect memories, actually took a step backward and whispered something in their native language. When the translator converted it to Standard Galactic, it came out as, "How is this possible? You should not be here." Marcus approached the crystalline with his usual polite smile and introduced himself as if nothing unusual had happened. But Zarathel saw the way the ancient being's geometric form trembled slightly, and how the other elderly diplomats watched Marcus with expressions that looked almost like fear. That night, Zarathel confronted her husband directly. She told him about all the strange occurrences, the security breaches, the artifact responses, and the reactions of the ancient diplomats. She asked him to explain what was really going on. Marcus sat quietly for a long time, looking out at the stars through their bedroom window. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this must be confusing for you, but some things are complicated to explain and the timing hasn't been right." "What timing?" Zarathel asked. "We're married now. We're supposed to share everything." Marcus turned to face her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that looked much older than his apparent age. "Soon," he said.
"Very soon some visitors will arrive who will make everything clear."
"I promise I'll explain then." 3 days later, the palace received a message that the Arch-Primarch Veltar was coming for an unannounced state visit. The news that Arch-Primarch Veltar was coming to visit sent the entire palace into a state of controlled panic. Veltar belonged to a species so ancient and powerful that they were living legends. His people, the Eternal Hierarchs, had existed since the early Empire, days of the galaxy when most other species were still developing basic tools. Veltar himself was over 50,000 years old and had personally witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. He served as the senior diplomatic representative for the oldest alliance in known space, a group of species that predated the current Galactic Council by millions of years. In all recorded history, Veltar had never bowed to anyone or shown deference to any other being. King Morveth called an emergency meeting of his entire court to prepare for the visit. Protocol experts worked around the clock to ensure every detail of the reception would meet the Arch-Primarch's expectations. The slightest mistake could be interpreted as an insult that might affect diplomatic relations for centuries. "We don't even know why he's coming," the king said, pacing nervously in the throne room. "Veltar hasn't left his homeworld in over 3,000 years. Something extraordinary must have happened to bring him here." The preparation was intense. The palace's finest chambers were cleaned and prepared with special atmospheric controls to accommodate Veltar's unique physiology. Ceremonial guards practiced ancient greeting rituals that had not been performed in living memory. The royal kitchen struggled to create appropriate refreshments for a being whose species absorbed energy directly from cosmic radiation. Through all of this activity, Marcus remained strangely calm. While everyone else was stressed about the visit, he continued his normal routine of reading in the library and taking quiet walks through the palace gardens. When Zarathel asked if he was nervous about meeting such an important figure, Marcus just smiled and said he was looking forward to it. The day of Veltar's arrival, the entire court gathered in the grand reception hall. Representatives from dozens of species came to witness this historic visit. The hall itself was a masterpiece of architecture, with crystal pillars that reached high into the vaulted ceiling and walls decorated with artwork from across the galaxy. Veltar's ship landed at precisely the appointed time. It was a vessel unlike anything most people had ever seen, built from materials that seemed to shift between solid matter and pure energy. When the Arch-Primarch emerged, his presence filled the air with a subtle vibration that made everyone feel they were in the company of something far greater than themselves. Veltar stood nearly 3 meters tall, with a crystalline body that contained swirling patterns of light. His 6 eyes glowed with deep purple radiance, and when he moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around him. He wore robes made from starlight itself, and his voice resonated with harmonics that touched the minds of everyone present. King Morveth stepped forward to deliver the formal greeting, his words carefully chosen to show respect without appearing weak. The ceremony proceeded exactly as planned, with each ritual performed flawlessly. Veltar acknowledged the king's welcome with appropriate dignity, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. Then Marcus arrived. The human had been delayed by a minor diplomatic matter, and entered the hall just as the formal presentations were concluding. He wore his usual simple clothes and walked with his characteristic unhurried pace, offering apologetic smiles to the guards who stepped aside for him. The moment Veltar's 6 eyes focused on Marcus, the ancient being's entire demeanor changed. The Arch-Primarch, who had maintained perfect composure for 50,000 years, suddenly looked as if he had seen something impossible. Without warning, Veltar moved toward Marcus with startling speed. The gathered crowd watched in shocked silence as the most powerful diplomatic figure in galactic history approached the seemingly ordinary human. Then something happened that no one present would ever forget. Veltar, the being who had never shown deference to anyone, dropped to the floor in complete prostration before Marcus. His crystalline form pressed against the ground while he spoke in a language so old that only the most ancient translation systems could process it. The words that emerged from the translators sent ripples of confusion and awe through the assembled crowd. "Forgive me, Inheritor. I did not know you walked among the younger races." The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in the hall stared at the impossible scene before them. The Arch-Primarch, who commanded the respect of entities that could destroy stars, was bowing to a human who most people had considered barely more than a primitive newcomer to galactic civilization. Marcus looked surprised for a moment, then his expression shifted to something that might have been resignation. He stepped forward and gently helped Veltar to his feet, speaking in that same ancient language with perfect fluency. "Please rise, old friend," Marcus said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to make the air itself listen. "There is no need for such formality here." As Veltar stood, his eyes remained fixed on Marcus with a mixture of reverence and something that looked almost like relief. "We have waited so long for your return to active guidance," he said, switching to standard galactic language so others could understand. "The hierarchs will be pleased to know the inheritors have not abandoned us." Zarathel felt her world tilting as she watched this exchange. Her quiet, gentle husband was speaking as an equal to the most powerful being she had ever encountered. More than that, Veltar was treating Marcus as if he were some kind of superior. King Morveth, who had been frozen in shock, finally found his voice. "Arch-Primarch," he said carefully, "I believe there may be some confusion. Marcus is a human diplomat from Earth. His species has only recently joined galactic civilization." Veltar turned to look at the king, and for a moment his ancient eyes showed something that might have been amusement. "Your Majesty," he said with gentle patience, "the being you know as Marcus Chen carries the heritage of those who shaped this galaxy long before your species or mine learned to look at the stars. He is an inheritor of the first ones, the guardians who have watched over us all since the beginning." The words hit Zarathel like a physical blow. She stared at Marcus, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The way he moved with quiet confidence through any situation. The knowledge he displayed about things he should never have encountered. The automatic respect he received from beings who prided themselves on their superiority. Marcus caught her gaze and she saw something in his eyes that had been there all along, hidden behind his carefully maintained facade of human ordinariness. It was the look of someone who had carried immense responsibility for so long that it had become as natural as breathing. "I think," Marcus said quietly, "it's time for some explanations." The gathered crowd was still processing what they had witnessed when Veltar spoke again. "With your permission, Inheritor, I would like to convene the old protocols. There are matters that require your attention, and several of the younger species have reached critical junctures in their development." Marcus nodded slowly, and Zarathel realized that her understanding of everything was about to change completely. "Yes," Marcus said, "I suppose it is time." As word of what had happened spread through the palace and beyond, Zarathel found herself facing a new reality. The man she had married was not who she thought he was. The question that burned in her mind was simple but terrifying. If Marcus was not really a human diplomat, then what exactly was he? That evening, as representatives from the most ancient species in the galaxy began arriving at the palace in response to some signal she had not detected, Zarathel prepared to learn truths that would reshape her understanding of the universe itself. That night Marcus led Zarathel to a part of the palace she had never seen before. They walked through corridors that should not have existed, passing through walls that opened at Marcus's approach and closed behind them. The princess realized that her husband knew the palace far better than she did, despite having lived there for only 6 months. They arrived at a circular chamber deep beneath the royal residence. The room was filled with soft light that seemed to come from the walls themselves, Ancient symbols covered every surface, glowing gently with colors that had no names in any language Zarathel knew. "This room was built by your ancestors," Marcus said, running his hand along one of the symbol-covered walls. "They prepared it for this conversation, even though they knew it might be thousands of years before it was needed." Zarathel stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "What conversation? Marcus, please just tell me what's happening. Tell me who you really are." Marcus sat down on one of the crystal formations that served as furniture and gestured for her to join him. When she was settled, he took her hands in his, just as he had during their wedding ceremony. But this time, instead of the overwhelming vastness she had sensed before, she felt something else: sadness, loneliness, and the weight of immense responsibility. "My name really is Marcus Chen," he began. "I was born on Earth in a city called San Francisco. Everything I've told you about my childhood and my education is true, but what I haven't told you is what Earth really is and what humans actually are." He paused, looking around at the ancient symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his words. "Earth is not just another planet where intelligent life happened to evolve," he continued. "It's a sanctuary world, created by beings so powerful that the species you think of as ancient would consider them gods. These beings called themselves the First Ones, and they shaped this galaxy long before any of the current civilizations existed." Zarathel felt a chill run through her. "You're talking about myths and legends. Stories that children learn but adults know aren't real." Marcus smiled sadly. "The stories are real, Zara. The First Ones guided the development of life throughout the galaxy for millions of years. They prevented wars that would have destroyed entire star systems. They seeded technologies that allowed young species to advance without destroying themselves. They maintained the balance that allowed thousands of different forms of life to coexist." He stood and walked to the center of the room, where a complex pattern of symbols formed a spiral on the floor. As he stepped into the spiral, the symbols began to glow brighter. "Eventually, the First Ones decided it was time for them to move beyond physical existence," Marcus said. "But they couldn't simply abandon the galaxy. Too many species still needed guidance. Too many potential conflicts required careful management. So they created inheritors." The word echoed in the chamber with a resonance that made Zarathel's bones vibrate. She remembered Veltar using that same word when he bowed to Marcus. "Humans," Marcus continued, "are the descendants of the First Ones. We carry fragments of their power and knowledge. We're tasked with continuing their work, watching over the galaxy and guiding younger species through the critical phases of their development." Zarathel stood up, her legs suddenly unsteady. "That's impossible. Humans are new to space travel. You've only had technology for a few hundred years. You can't even live as long as most other species." Marcus turned to face her, and now she could see the ancient sadness in his eyes more clearly. "That's the disguise we maintain," he said. "For the system to work, the species we guide cannot know they're being guided. They have to make their own choices, find their own paths. If they knew that humans were manipulating events, they would either become dependent on us or rebel against us. Either outcome would be disastrous." He waved his hand, and the chamber's walls became transparent, showing them a view of the galaxy itself. Stars wheeled slowly overhead, their light painting patterns that revealed the scope of what he was describing. "So we hide," Marcus said. "We pretend to be a young, weak species that just happened to develop space travel. We send our people out as diplomats, traders, explorers, and refugees. To everyone else, we look like harmless newcomers trying to find our place in galactic civilization. But in reality," Zarathel whispered, understanding beginning to dawn, "in reality, we're everywhere. We've been guiding galactic development for thousands of years. Every major peace treaty, every technological breakthrough that prevented a species from destroying itself, every mysterious disappearance of a particularly aggressive military force, that's been us." Zarathel sank back down onto the crystal seat, her mind reeling. "The terrorist attack during our second month of marriage, when you evacuated those people through impossible routes. I created temporary spatial distortions," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "It's a basic technique that most inheritors learn early. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, but using the ability meant I risked exposing myself. And the artifacts in the museum that respond to you, they recognize the energy signature of the First Ones. Many of those artifacts were created by our ancestors or contain fragments of their technology. They're trying to communicate with me because they know what I am. Zarathel thought about all the strange incidents over the past months, seeing them now in a completely different light. The security systems that let you into restricted areas? They were programmed by species that knew the first ones. The quantum locks contain recognition patterns that identify inheritors as having unlimited access. And our marriage? The question came out as barely a whisper. Marcus sat down beside her again, his expression becoming even more gentle. Your species is approaching a critical evolutionary threshold, he said. Within the next few centuries, the Celestial Dominion will develop the power to either become a true force for peace in the galaxy or to become a threat that would require intervention. I was sent here to observe and, if necessary, to provide subtle guidance. So it was all fake, Zarathel said, feeling something break inside her chest. The courtship, the marriage, everything. No, Marcus said firmly, taking her hands again.
Zara, the mission was real, but what I feel for you is completely genuine.
I wasn't supposed to fall in love with you. That was never part of the plan. But you're brilliant, kind and strong in ways that have nothing to do with political advantage. Loving you has been the most real thing in my life. She looked into his eyes, trying to see past the revelation to find the man she had married. How do I know that's true? If you've been lying about everything else, because inheritors don't lie about love, Marcus said. We can't. It's one of the few things our nature won't allow us to fake. The emotional connections we form are always genuine, even when everything else about our lives is carefully constructed. Before Zarathel could respond, the chamber filled with a soft chiming sound. Marcus looked up, his expression becoming alert. What's happening? She asked. The other inheritors are responding to Veltar's presence, Marcus said. When an Archprimarch openly recognizes one of us, it triggers ancient protocols. They're coming here to assess the situation and determine what comes next. As if to confirm his words, the chamber's walls became transparent again, showing them ships approaching from across the galaxy. These vessels moved in ways that defied known physics, appearing and disappearing as they traveled through dimensions that normal space travel couldn't access. How many of you are there? Zarathel asked. Enough, Marcus said. We're scattered throughout the galaxy, usually working alone or in small groups. Most of us have never met each other. But when something like this happens, when our cover is broken, we have to coordinate our response. The ships continued to arrive, some so advanced that they looked more like controlled energy phenomena than actual spacecraft. Zarathel realized that within hours her palace would be hosting beings with power beyond anything she had ever imagined. What happens now? She asked. Marcus looked at her with an expression that mixed love, sadness, and determination. Now we decide whether it's time for humanity to step out of the shadows and take an open role in galactic affairs, and whether you're willing to stand beside me when the universe learns what humans really are. By morning, the palace was transformed. Ships from across the galaxy filled the sky, their designs ranging from crystalline structures that sang with harmonic resonance to vessels that existed partially outside normal space-time. Representatives from species that Zarathel had only read about in ancient texts were arriving to witness what many were calling the most significant diplomatic event in galactic history. But the most remarkable visitors were the humans. They came from every corner of known space, and Zarathel finally understood why humans had seemed so unremarkable to most people. They had deliberately cultivated that impression. The refugees fleeing from conflicts were actually agents monitoring unstable regions. The traders who appeared at critical moments with exactly the resources needed to prevent disasters were carrying out carefully planned interventions. The explorers who discovered new worlds always seemed to arrive just before other species might have claimed them, destructively. Marcus introduced her to some of his fellow inheritors. During the morning preparations, Dr. Sarah, Kim had spent 30 years posing as a medical researcher, while secretly preventing 3 different plagues that could have wiped out entire star systems. Captain James Wright commanded what appeared to be a simple cargo vessel, but was actually one of the most advanced ships in the galaxy, capable of stopping fleet invasions single-handedly. Maria Santos worked as a cultural anthropologist but was really monitoring the psychological development of young civilizations. Each of them greeted Zarathel with warmth and respect, but she could see the weight they all carried. They had spent their lives maintaining elaborate deceptions, forming relationships with people they could never be completely honest with, and making decisions that affected the fate of billions, while pretending to be ordinary members of an unremarkable species. "It's lonely," Maria admitted when Zarathel asked what their lives were like. "We do meaningful work, but we can never share the satisfaction of our successes. When we prevent a war, we have to watch other people take credit for the peace. When we guide a species away from self-destruction, we have to pretend it was their own wisdom that saved them." The morning's main event was a gathering in the Grand Assembly Hall, where representatives from dozens of species had come to witness what they were calling the revelation. Word had spread quickly through diplomatic channels that the humans were more than they appeared, though most people still had no idea of the true scope of human influence. King Morveth had spent the night in emergency consultation with his advisors, trying to understand what this meant for the Celestial Dominion. When he met privately with Zarathel before the assembly, his expression was a mixture of awe and concern. "Daughter," he said, "I need to know where your loyalties lie. If what Arch-Primarch Veltar suggested is true, your husband belongs to a species that has been manipulating galactic affairs for centuries. As future ruler of our people, how do you view this revelation?" Zarathel had spent the sleepless night wrestling with the same question. Everything she thought she knew about recent history was now suspect. How many of the great decisions made by galactic leaders had actually been subtly influenced by human inheritors? How many crises that had been mysteriously resolved were actually the result of human intervention? "Father," she said finally, "I think we need to understand what their true intentions are before we decide how to respond." The assembly itself was unlike anything in galactic history. Veltar took the central platform and spoke in his ancient voice about the true nature of human civilization. He revealed that the eternal hierarchs had known the truth for millennia, and had been working in coordination with the inheritors to maintain galactic stability. "The species you know as humanity," Veltar announced to the shocked crowd, "are the inheritors of the first ones, the shapers of this galaxy. For 50,000 years they have guided your development, prevented your destruction, and maintained the peace that has allowed your civilizations to flourish." The reaction was immediate and intense. Some species expressed outrage at being deceived. Others demanded to know how many of their historical achievements were really their own. A few accused the humans of treating the rest of the galaxy like children who couldn't be trusted with the truth. But there were also voices of gratitude and understanding. Elder statesmen from several civilizations admitted that they had suspected some hidden influence had been preventing catastrophes that should have destroyed them long ago. The representative from the Andromedan collective spoke emotionally about 3 separate occasions when mysterious intervention had saved their homeworld from destruction. Marcus stepped forward to address the assembly, and the hall fell silent. Standing there in his simple clothes, he looked exactly like the unremarkable human diplomat everyone had thought he was, but now his voice carried an authority that seemed to resonate with the fundamental forces of the universe. "We never wanted to deceive you," he said, "but direct intervention would have prevented you from growing into the remarkable civilizations you've become. Every species needs to find its own path, make its own choices, and learn from its own mistakes. Our role has always been to ensure that those mistakes don't destroy you before you have the chance to learn from them." He gestured to the diverse crowd of beings filling the hall. "Look around you. This gathering includes species with radically different biologies, philosophies, and technologies. You've learned to coexist and even cooperate despite these differences. That's not because we forced you to, it's because you chose to. We simply removed some of the obstacles that might have prevented those choices. The questions that followed were intense and sometimes hostile. How could humans claim the right to make decisions for other species? How many wars had they prevented that might have been necessary for growth? How could anyone trust them now that their deception had been revealed?" Marcus answered each question with patience and honesty. Yes, the inheritors had made difficult decisions that affected other species without their consent. Yes, there had been times when they had prevented conflicts that might have led to important growth. But they had also prevented the complete extinction of 17 different civilizations and stopped at least 40 conflicts that would have devastated entire regions of the galaxy. The most difficult moment came when the representative from the Tau Ceti Alliance asked directly, "If you possess such power, why maintain the pretense at all? Why not simply rule openly?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because power without consent is tyranny, no matter how benevolent the intentions. The moment we reveal ourselves as your superiors is the moment we stop being your protectors and become your rulers. That transformation would corrupt us and diminish you. Zarathel watched her husband during these exchanges and realized something that both amazed and terrified her. Marcus wasn't just representing humanity to the galaxy, he was representing the galaxy to humanity. The decisions made in this hall would determine whether the inheritors continued their hidden guardianship or stepped into the light as open leaders. The debate continued for hours, but gradually a consensus began to emerge. The galaxy had benefited enormously from human protection, even if it had been provided without permission. The current crisis facing many species, resource depletion, territorial conflicts, and the emergence of hostile artificial intelligences, required the kind of coordination that only the inheritors could provide. By afternoon, a new framework had been proposed. The humans would maintain their protective role, but would do so through formal diplomatic channels. A council of inheritors would work openly with the Galactic Council to address major threats while respecting the autonomy of individual species. As the Assembly moved toward accepting this arrangement, Zarathel found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. Marcus had been assigned to guide her species through its critical evolutionary period. That mission would now continue, but openly rather than in secret. Standing before the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, with Marcus beside her and the weight of truth finally revealed, Zarathel made her decision. As Princess of the Celestial Dominion and heir to our throne, she announced, I pledge our cooperation with this new arrangement. More than that, I offer our world as a center for this new form of open cooperation between the inheritors and the galactic community. Marcus looked at her with surprise and gratitude. Are you certain? He asked quietly. This will change everything about your life and your rule. Zarathel smiled, remembering the gentle human diplomat she had married and seeing him clearly for the first time as the cosmic guardian he had always been. I fell in love with you when I thought you were just a human diplomat, she said. Learning that you're actually one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy doesn't change that. If anything, it makes me proud to stand beside you. As the assembly concluded and the framework for humanity's new role was formally established, Zarathel realized that her quiet, unremarkable husband had been carrying the weight of galactic civilization on his shoulders from the moment they met. Now finally, he wouldn't have to carry that burden alone. The harmless human she had married was indeed the guardian of the galaxy, and she was ready to help him protect it.